Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Just as a caveat, we are recording this because we're going to be utilizing this Rise SkillShare to obviously record it, polish it up, and then we're going to put it across our global network for Rise, created by Barclays. But before I dive deep into this, and we're going to have some fun and talk about hiring your first employees, I just want to give a quick overview of what we're about at Rise. So Rise, created by Barclays, is a global network of some of the world's top innovators, all working together to create what we believe is the future of financial services. Our mission is to connect technology, talent, and trends from the Rise network to ideally accelerate innovation and growth within the financial industry. We have two clubs, one at Rise NYC in New York, which is just boofing it at the moment, loads of companies over there. And of course, this one here in Shoreditch, where I have currently 45 fintech companies. So it's a cracking place for collaboration. And we are #the home of fintech. But more importantly, let's talk about today. So part of our what we do in relation to events is we have SkillShare events. And today we've got three cracking speakers and hosted by Anastasia, our very own Anastasia, who is the head of Rise London and our fintech platform lead. And we're going to be talking about hiring your first employees. Let's have a little chat about who we got on the panel here, if you like, all relaxed in their various locations. First of all, we've got Ellis Cedar, who's the CEO and founder of Santa Monica Talent. I've known Ellis for a number of years now, and he's just good at what he does. He's a true entrepreneur at heart. And I know that Ellis has been around for 20 years of experience now, building technology and digital departments for clients ranging from VC-backed scale-ups to global investment banks. He's lived in and worked in London, Sydney, Singapore, Hong Kong, and California. And Ellis has strong relationships at technology and digital communities across the world. Through his business, Santa Monica Talent, you can access this unique global network as you're scaling your business. They build exceptional sales, marketing, software, HR, product, ops, and leadership teams. And I've seen this in action. And their services are designed ideally for Series A, B, and C scale-ups or high-growth companies of 20 to 200 people. Alongside him, we also have Alia Dikuchin. I think that's a correct pronunciation. You can correct me if not. Alia is people and culture lead at 3S Money, who's a Rise member here in London. They're a fintech scale-up that offers international business banking solutions in over 190 countries. They have offices in 5 countries, and Alia is building a dynamic company culture, would you believe this, that saw 160% headcount growth in 2021 alone. Working at the intersection of candidate and employee experience, Alia's team is responsible for talent acquisition, employee satisfaction, and inclusivity. She's a graduate of the University of Bristol, and Alia previously worked at Wiser, an award-winning creative and recruitment company. Her thoughts on company culture and inclusivity have been published in The Times and Raconteur. We also have, of course, Paul Wilkes, who's just sat around the corner from me here at Rise in the club, who's one of the partners at Osney Capital, an early-stage venture firm focused on investing in cyber, fintech, and legal tech startups. Paul has over 15 years of experience as a financial services and regulatory lawyer, including 8 years as a partner leading the corporate team at a leading offshore law firm. He built a diverse practice, including advising on venture capital, fund structuring, M&A, banking and finance, and financial services regulation. He's a startup mentor and advisor, working with Oxford University Innovation, the Oxford Entrepreneurship Centre, and the Innovation Forum. Paul finally has an MBA from the University of Oxford and LLB from the University of New South Wales, and a first-class honours degree in physiotherapy from Sydney University. Our 3 esteemed guests, and I know all 3 of them, they're great, are looked after, as I said earlier, by our very own Anastasia Kizima, who's head of Rise London and fintech platform lead. Now, those who are joining us, I've got you all on mute, but at the there is going to be times through the hour where you can raise your hand and just off mute and ask questions. But that's about it for me. Over to you, Anastasia.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. First of all, thank you for everybody on the panel for taking the time. I am thrilled to dive into this topic with all of you and get your expertise on it. I think it's incredibly rare to get such a good group of people to talk about this, especially considering the fact that leaders spend, roughly 20% of their time hiring employees and recruiting the right people for their company. And especially in the beginning of a startup, this is such a critical moment, and this could be a make or break thing for a company. So I guess if we could kick off, if I could ask Paul, actually, obviously one of the first things that a company would be doing in early stage would be raising funds. How detailed should a company be around who they're looking to hire and the cost of the potential hires as they're looking to fundraise?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's nice to see everyone, and Tony, thank you for the kind words that I wrote for you. Sounds great. I think the key here is when you're going into a fundraise, and your use of funds is an important part of that data that the investor will look at, and just to understand what your plans are for the next 12 to 18 months, which is ordinarily the runway for which you're raising the money for. Built into that plan and that use of funds is going to be lots of assumptions. We all know there's going to be assumptions on how fast you're going to grow, which aspects of the business need more resource than others. We're just looking for sensible assumptions around that growth, and assumptions that the Jenga blocks stack well together. So we're not looking for granular detail, particularly we're talking about first employees here. So this is quite early on in the life cycle of the business, pre-seed or seed stage or Series A stage. You're looking at obviously much beyond the first employees. So we want sensible assumptions about how much we think it's going to cost to hire the relevant employee, and how did you make that assumption will be a question. How long will it take you to hire them is a really important question. People, and I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will know much better than me, they don't magically appear. It takes time to find people and to bring them in and to settle them in and get them to be productive in the team. So from my perspective, it has to be part of your use of funds. Be really clear on what aspects you're looking to spend the money on. And on the people side, make some assumptions, speak to some people like Alice and others, get a good feel for what the price in the market is and how you can reasonably assume you'll meet your targets on that side.
Thank you. And I guess with that, how do you feel about the breakdown between the cost actual salary and the shares? Is there a preference you see from your perspective?
Yeah, Alice, be interested in your views on this as well. But
yeah, that was my next.
But for first employees, I think a really important thing, and startups come in many different shapes and sizes. It could be a sole founder looking to employ one person, or a founding team of 5 making their first employee and growing up as a business. I think the first employee, cash and shares, it's really about, can you get this employee to buy into the vision? And that's as an investor, that's a really good sign. Can you build that reality distortion field where people buy into the excitement and the vision of your business? And does that attract some discount from what might be the market rate at a bog standard firm that's post its growth phase? And that will then iterate itself into equity or stocks or options in some form. What's your thoughts, Alice?
No, it's a good point. It depends on, I think it goes back to what the founders are as well. Like, what's the skill sets of the founders?
Yeah.
So I think if, let's say like the best case scenario is there's 2 founders, one technical, one commercial, then you can work backwards from there. Like, what's the gap? Do they need a COO to join as the first hire? Or alternative is, what happens if there's 2 technical co-founders? Then you would probably advise them to bring in a CRO, revenue generating new client person as their first hire. So I do think it goes back to what the founders' profiles are, and then you build it around where the gaps. And like you said about the what stage of company is what you offer the person. I think if it's really early, it's always good to give someone two options where you give them a slightly higher base salary and lower equity potential. And then you give them a second option as well, which is a lower base with a much higher equity clip. And obviously you want the person to take the second option, but it gives you a good indication of risk appetite, and also just letting the person know like very early that we're not going to match a blue chip. It's impossible at this stage.
Yeah. I think that selling a vision is a really important part for any startup, whether it's recruiting customers, recruiting investors, or recruiting staff.
No, I would completely agree. And Alice, I guess if you could talk a bit more about the value proposition of a company and how they could work around building that. How do you create a proposition that makes people want to join?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult, isn't it? I think it's not spoken about enough, really. The value proposition, or the employment, the official term would be EVP, like the employment value proposition. I think like the best case scenario is like a Patagonia. You know, let's be real here. They're just selling fleeces and jumpers. Obviously, it's not a technical company, but everyone knows they're mission driven, focused on sustainability, and you really can get people really want to work for them. So I think that's probably like the poster child of building up a brilliant value proposition. I think it's quite hard in this market when there's so many companies that do similar things to try and persuade someone to join. Like within the fintech world, for instance, there's quite a lot of companies doing similar business models, paying similar salaries in similar locations. So really, I think the talent pool chooses who has a similar vision that they align to. And I think that's one thing that we noticed from candidates, like pre-credit crunch, pre-COVID, post-COVID. It seems to be top of the list of what people are asking for now, like mission driven. That didn't really come up as much as I would say in the last 12 months or so.
Very interesting. I think that's a trend across a lot of different industries, including kind of customer behavior as well. So that's just makes sense that it would also translate to companies. And Anya, can you talk about kind of what kind of person would you be looking for to hire as well? So if you build this vision and you have your value proposition and you have a pool of candidates to choose from, what are some things that you're looking for and that you would recommend people really pay attention to, especially for the first employees?
Yeah, I think it's really important to not try and fit a certain type of mold, that by bringing on a real variety of employees or teammates, then you have loads of different experience and approaches that you can pull from, and then you can kind of pick the best bits of what works best, and then you have this real dynamic feel. And I think keeping that, when you're a startup, and we're now a scale up, but that startup fuel is what you want to hold on to for the longest, where it's this different experience and there's this excitement and there's this kind of rush to get into work. So I think that kind of person that I would imagine almost thinking faster than they can speak and typing quicker than they can eloquently do so, that kind of excitement feeling is what really gets people kind of into it 100 miles per hour, more so than, qualification this or 5 years at, a competitor fintech, whatever it might be.
I just, sorry to butt in, but just that move from startup to scale up, have you found that you've had to change the shape of person you're looking for, or how has your sort of approach changed?
I think a little bit, because you have more people involved, more locations involved, and different scale of projects involved as well. We're now working with more and more clients, with more kind of plans of action for new products that we're rolling out. Stay tuned. If you want to check out our LinkedIn, you can see all sorts going on. So it does mean the criteria of the boxes you need to tick does change. It's quite organic. And because it happens so quickly, you almost can't keep up with it. But it's an exciting problem to have, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess my question is really kind of to both you and Alice together, in terms of, you touched on the fact that you're in different offices now, and it's really changed the way you're recruiting employees or the way you interact with them. when it comes to remote and hybrid work, have you seen that changes as well? Are you seeing any trends, even in terms of, are most people looking to work in hybrid? I know 3S Money most of the time is in, for example.
Yeah, we actually chop and change. Well, we've seen a chop and change where there was kind of a move more into the emphasis on hybrid, whereas now we have more flexibility, but everyone just keeps coming in. And I think people really enjoy it. There's the buzz of being able to go into a meeting room, action things quicker. There's the speed element and a communication element that really powers through, and you're able to really focus on getting stuff done, which is what everyone is, trying to all do together at the end of the day. It's vision alignment.
Fair enough. Do you think that comes from the fact that you've hired all these people who are excited to be there in the first place?
Yes.
Fair enough.
Proud team.
I can certainly say that, with 3S Money, they're an engaging company. I've seen them from when they just had the idea back in the day, and I've seen how they've grown. You've done a great job, by the way. But as a company, those first employees, they are welcomed correctly. They are molded and sort of accepted just by like osmosis straight into the current team very quickly. And it's just a wonderfully engaging company. So it's having the right people in the right positions doing the right stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And Alice, have you seen what is the trend that you've seen in terms of remote and office work and hybrid work approaches? Have you seen a particular trend in the market, and things that people are asking for in terms of companies, but also individuals?
It's a good question. I think going back to 3S, it's a very, I think everyone likes going into the office for 3S. It's a high energy type of environment. You can see the type of person that would thrive. There's no consistency in the market. That's the honest answer. Across the board now, it seems to split into three very distinct categories. There's either fully remote, and some companies have got used to it during COVID and they really like it. And this is coming from top down. And then there's companies which are hybrid, 2 or 3 days in the office, typically choose the days you want to come in. And then there's the group of, we'd like you back in the office. What I am noticing is that the 5 days a week in the office is financial services, fintech, law firms, and consulting. It's quite consistent. And then it seems to be everybody else. So, I mean, right now it's quite fascinating with all the candidates, they're all asking the same thing. Like, do I have to go into the office? It's like the first conversation. Like, obviously this is a new thing. We never had that up until the last 18 months or so. I don't think it's played out yet. I think we've still got another 12 months where I think different companies are going to try a different, different styles really, and whatever works for each company.
I've got lots of contacts in professional services firms in the London and elsewhere, and they are struggling to an extent, particularly if they've got workers who can, as the nature of professional services, sit quietly and do their work, and it's less collaborative in some circumstances than other types of work. Then naturally it lends itself to, yes, I can work from home 4 days a week if I want. I'll come in for the team meeting, etc. Whereas sort of scale up startup world where it is much more faster paced and collaborative and things are changing more consistently or more quickly, being together seems to be a much more important thing. But the other aspect is where there's young people or new graduates or new to roles, it's very hard to train people remotely unless you are a remote first firm, I think. If you're trying to go hybrid, then if the trainee or the junior doesn't have their report in the office, then they're not going to learn much looking at a white wall. It's
true. We've heard that a lot. I think it's been a disaster zone for first, second jobbers. If they've been left to work remotely, it doesn't seem to work very well at all. What is noticeable though, is I think it depends on the function. So can you have a sales team fully remote? It seems hard. I don't know how that really works, to be honest with you. I mean, some companies are trying it, versus can you have your software development team remote? Yes, it's been a thing for 20, 30 years already. And then probably there's an argument for middle office roles, marketing, possibly HR. Can they work remotely or hybrid? Probably more so than a sales team. So maybe it comes down to the function. Maybe you end up with lots of sales teams in the offices 5 days a week.
Mm. And so looking at first employees, that's the time to start thinking about that culture of, is it office first or is it remote first, etc., and sort of laying that groundwork.
Paul, from your perspective, would that make a difference in terms of investment? If the team comes by and says, I have this team, we're all going to be remote, but this is the team that we're hiring. Would that make a big difference? How would you kind of approach that?
I think I'll lean into my legal training on this question and say it really depends. Which is the honest truth. I think you get a sense from a team of how well they work together based on how they interact with their output and what they've achieved and the milestones they've reached. I'm slightly skeptical about we're hybrid and do a bit of both unless there's real alignment on what days are in and what days are out. But all in or all out are both completely valid models. And actually the all out model gives a whole world of choice of who is that first employee, both time zone wise and cost wise. Creates complexity in other ways to think about, but does open up opportunities for recruits.
But there is possibly an argument, I mean, it's happening in the States already, of a two-tiered salary for remote versus in-office. So in the US, I think all driven mostly from Silicon Valley. Like if you're, let's say, a Google software developer and you're being paid a Silicon Valley salary, but you've actually moved to, I don't know, Arizona, do you still command the same salary for Silicon Valley, or does that not head towards a lower cost working location? So that's already started. So I don't see any reason why that couldn't start in the UK. So people are given two options: come into the office, we'd like you in, or if you want to work remote and you're in a role we think could work, then it's, I don't know, a sliding scale, 30% less, because you don't have the travel costs and you're living, it's going to cost you less to live in wherever rather than London.
I've seen that as an observation, but I haven't seen people take those steps yet. Have you seen people take any steps in that direction yet?
It's happened in the States. It's definitely a thing in the big American tech firms. Because I think if you think of like a Google or Facebook, they would have software developers in these other locations. So it opens up a whole wide range of issues around, well, why are you paying a software developer in Arizona X, and then the Silicon Valley developers paid a lot more, but still living in the same city? So it's an absolute minefield.
It is a tricky one. If you don't need to be in London and you can be somewhere else with a lower cost base, then why can't you be in Johannesburg or Durban or somewhere else? It creates its own challenges.
It is, but I think it goes back to what we were saying about function. So client facing, you probably need to be in the city probably to meet potential customers and clients. Marketing, there's definitely an argument you could be remote.
But I think things like a sales floor, you can't replicate the buzz of a sales floor at home. So sales floors just lend themselves to, you buzz off each other, you get off the phone, you talk about that deal, you close something, you open an opportunity, all of that, it creates this hustle and bustle that people really love. And when you work from home, you just don't get that productivity out of yourself. It's the same with, recruitment or anything like that involves the kind of client facing or opportunity facing interaction. You just need to see each other do it.
It's true. I think for those type of roles, it makes total sense.
Makes sense. And for kind of the first hires in terms of job title, so we talk about different sliding scales of salary. As you're hiring first employees, what kind of job titles would you recommend? Maybe I turn to Alice with this.
It's obviously very topical, isn't it? I think one of the challenges in the London sort of startup market is that the job titles are very inconsistent. There's no synergy. You see this across, again, sales or marketing or even HR. Like it's, you want to bring in your first, let's say it's your first head of marketing. What's the job title? Is it VP marketing? Is it marketing director? Is it a CMO? Essentially, they're all going to do the same role. Does that mean it's a different salary? I think what really seems to be the case is, are the founders, if they're from the US, they typically lean towards calling it something VP. More European typically leans towards director. And then how comfortable are you giving away a C-level title early? I think probably the line in the sand for giving a C-level title early is, does that person have the capability to go to a board meeting and speak to investors? I think if they tick that box, then possibly giving them the C-level title is fine. But then you've always got to remember that you've already capped out on that function. So if you bring in, we'll just use marketing as an example, if you bring in a marketing person, give them the CMO title, you can't then bring someone above them. So you really have to think, is this the person that you can see with the company for the next 2, 3, 5 years?
And also, if not above them, a role they can grow into, because their progression is partly their own title as much as it is the package as well. So if there's room for growth, laying the groundwork for that, I think is quite helpful and something that logically stacks together. But that's the fun with the startup. You can use your own terms to an extent and set your own rules, but you should have some logical structure to what those rules are.
And I think a lot of the time it's almost people-led, so you can create titles and specs or job specs around the sort of talent that you've just brought on. You have that little bit of flexibility until you get to a certain stage in the business where the sort of roles are filled, and then you start replicating and scaling department to department. But those early stages, you get a little bit more room to play around and tweak it around the person or the talent that you're bringing on.
And what sort of number of staff did you find with yourselves that became it became its own structure as opposed to playing with it and finding what worked?
Well, when I joined to start the people function last February, we were 25 roughly, and now we are 80 with a further 8 joining. So it's been a very, it's been a steep learning curve in terms of the different stages that we've been at.
Yeah.
I still think that you still have, you create your startup or scale up atmosphere. You decide when you want to really, until a certain point, become quite corporate and stuffy about it. So far, we're trying to really hold on to that startup sentiment because it's the playground of the fintech space. It's where you have the most fun, it's where you can get the most done, and you're the most agile. But it's definitely coming where you have more and more structure with titles and specs.
I think something that's overlooked as well is bringing people in early on an interim basis. So I think what typically people think of, or founders will think of immediately, is need to bring in a full-time, whatever, head of product, head of marketing, head of HR. But London's got such a strong interim talent pool of highly experienced scale-up executives that I really wouldn't dismiss that as an option early on, because A, you don't have to give any equity away, plus it's a trial and test scenario as well. You can bring someone in for 6 months, and if it goes amazingly well, then great, then maybe there's a discussion about coming in full time. But I think this could be utilized a lot more. Again, if you look at the States or in Silicon Valley, fractional consulting or portfolio careers, super common. It's definitely a thing here. You notice it in, again, HR or marketing a lot, or interim CTOs, versus trying to hire that full-time CTO, which would be, really difficult.
Yeah. I've seen it in the finance function as well, which naturally sort of fits a part-time CFO, etc.
Yeah,
it worked quite well. At a certain point, you do need that credibility in-house, of course.
Yeah, and Paul, can you talk a bit more kind of around that in terms of in-house employees and full-time employment versus consultants or maybe part-time employment? Kind of how would you approach that in terms of investment opportunity?
Yeah, so the binary between the consultant and the employee is an important distinction, an important consideration for a founder. The very simple rule that we use is, if it's something that's going to be an ongoing relationship for perhaps a technical role that you want to iterate your product over time and so on and so forth, then there is a misalignment of incentives in many cases of using a consultant who is incentivized to charge lots of fees by doing lots of work. Whereas if they work for you, they want to be as efficient as possible and get the dang project out of the way so they can do the next thing. So that can be challenging for some investors if the use of funds plan or budget is, yes, we have a tech product, but we're using a consultant to build the tech product completely externally, and we'll have a product at the end of it. But what if you need to iterate? You'll need more cash to do that again.
Mhm.
which can be a challenge. But the flip side, of course, is if you hire your own tech team and you've got a bunch of work at the start and then iterating work over time, you'll have the salary burden that you'll have to manage longer term. But hopefully in a startup / scale up world, you're hiring people that can grow with the business and continue to support the business. So it could end up being a balance of the two, really. If it's consulting piece, so getting advice on a particular regulatory issue in terms of your fintech, then a short-term consultant or external advice makes a lot of sense. But if there is a rule, and there isn't a hard rule, but the closest to a rule is we prefer building a team rather than a series of consultants that are external, and the alignment isn't quite as neat as an employee, particularly with equity.
How do you feel about no-code startups? Do you have any strong views about that?
It depends. It depends on what they're building. That's going to go on my business card now. But I think there is a risk with a pitch deck. If I start at the pitch deck level, there's a risk of using buzzwords in a pitch deck, which is AI, ML, blockchain, no code. What's the next one? ESG, perhaps, depending. I'd like to pick behind that and understand, is it truly no code? And there's a number of no code startups I've looked at, which actually have in their revenue to date, quite a large consultancy revenue. And what's that consultancy revenue? Well, that's implementation with putting the particular product into the customer's chain and their tech stack. Well, it's not quite no code then, because there's lots of implementation to be done, etc.
It's true. It's misleading, isn't it? Like, the actual term is kind of misleading, because there's always, it's essentially saying that they've found software that's already in existence that they can clip in to get them to at least I don't know, a Series A.
Yeah, and in some cases that is genuinely true. In others, I think just be careful with the buzzwords. I always like to look behind the buzzword and to understand it better. But I have no issue with your minimum viable product being something that's built on something that if you're proud of your MVP, you built it for too long, is the short answer. So having a view to have your own tech team longer term to iterate the product, because over time your customers will tell you what does or doesn't work, and you'll need that flexibility to move with that.
Because it's definitely something that you really didn't hear much of even up to 5 years ago, and like right now, it's coming up a lot more. And it kind of seems sensible enough when you hear how it's pitched.
Yeah, but I guess the challenge to that could be, ideas are great. Lots of people have ideas. Execution is key. But if your execution is dependent on a platform from someone else and you can't build it yourself or control it yourself, that's supply chain risk, to use a boring term.
Okay. And let's say you hired the people, you decide to go in-house and you're building this team out. In terms of, if we're thinking about salaries and compensation, and, how do you kind of think through that? And also, how do you think through that over a period of time? So, in terms of, there's been a trend in the market essentially around salaries rising from like 20 to 50% increases as a person progresses in the company. What are your thoughts on that? Is that sustainable? Is that something that is, maybe it's somebody you hired in and they've really grown into a role, as we've talked about, or kind of what do you think is driving that? And, what do you see that as a future? Can I turn to Alice for this?
Sure. I think you're right. We started noticing 50% pay rises last year. It's not something we typically see. And we saw it once or twice and just thought it was an outlier, and it's happening more and more. Weekly now, 50% pay rises, mostly around what I would describe as mid-level roles. So anything, let's say 40 to 70K, 50% pay rises, they're being paid. I don't think it's sustainable. It's impossible. But there probably are a few reasons for it. I would say there was salary stagnation in London for a good decade. Like, if you think of salaries from showing my age here, but post credit crunch, like 2011, 12, all the way up until the last year or so, they didn't really go up that much in digital. Not that much, nowhere near in line with inflation or how property prices have gone up. So I think we've just had this kind of like bottleneck of 10-year salary stagnation. And when you compare the London salaries to US salaries, it still looks really good value in London to scale up a business, which is why I still think you see the American conglomerates still coming over and building huge offices, you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, and VC-backed American scale-ups. The London salaries are just lower than New York or San Francisco by quite a big distance. So it's probably just been coming. I mean, the leadership roles, we're seeing 20-30% increases. And these are all increases on pre-COVID. So let's use, I don't know, 2019 numbers to 2022 numbers. But I also think it's never been easier to interview. So if you think about how easy it is today to interview, you know, you organize a video call and you can have 2 or 3 if you fancy per day, where up until 2019, maybe you'd have had a couple of interviews a week because you'd have physically gone to the office. I mean, we've got candidates in 5, 6, 7, 8 interview processes at the same time. That's the reality of what's happening right now. I do think this will last until the end of the year. And I mean, again, it's pure speculation, but I think there'll be I think the brakes will be put on across the board. And then I think most companies would have gone through this huge 12, 18, 24 month scale up, and then probably trying to figure out how to get productivity. Probably from early next year, I would say. So we've got a good 6 to 9 more months of what's happening right now, at least.
And I think it really puts the pressure as well on the internal teams to be able to sell the same vision that the founders were originally selling. Because these same people, they are, as you said, interviewing with multiple people that day. You've got to make sure that you sell what, you know, the company vision is, what you're going to look like 3 years down, 5 years down. Now you've got to get them excited, or else they're just going to go to the next interview and forget they even spoke to you. So it's really important for internal teams to be selling just as much as any of the sales teams or client managers or anything like that as well.
And Anya, do you focus on kind of training people around the vision, or is that just something that's embedded in the company? How do you make sure that message is, I'm assuming is you have a lot of people, as you mentioned, especially on your team. How do you make sure that everybody who interviews the new candidate does continue to say the same message and continues to sell the same vision?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And realigning on vision and having kind of almost refresher sessions on what our plan of action is really important. And we're kind of currently have lined one up for a few weeks' time to just keep going over it so that everyone has the same common goal. Because department to department, you might be about revenue generation, you might be about talent retention, market capture, things like that. But it's really crucial for the overall overarching goal to be a common one, or else you just get lost in what's going on, especially once you're hitting the kind of 100 people mark. There's so much happening. So we have all sorts of updates. On Thursday, we have our company update where we're doing a weather report from each company location, things like that, so that people get updates on what's going on and to know that we are on the right track. And that really feeds into interviewing as well, so that you really feel like you have a well-rounded understanding of what's happening in the business that you can then relay to candidates so that they can have an understanding in turn as well.
I think that question about that point, Ellis, about with technology now, you could interview 100 people for every role. I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts, Alia, about whether you should interview 100 people for the role if you can. Sort of there's a risk of your brand of, it's a small world, isn't it, more generally? And if you interview 100 people, it's bound to be some of them that know each other and say, oh, they were wasting my time. How do you control doing what you should rather than what you could? What do you think, Alia?
Oh, sorry. That was on Ellis. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's where partnerships for myself personally with recruiters, and I work actually with Ellis, that's how we hired our fantastic chief revenue officer. I generally like to have long-standing, trusting, mutual, respectful relationships with recruitment agencies, particularly with the C-level roles, because as you mentioned, it is a small world and you lose credibility pretty quickly if a number of people reaches out, because it just makes it seem like you're looking as opposed to, and even though you are, the reality is you are looking, but you have to act like you're not. Recruitment's almost like a hinge, or it's all about we want each other, but you do type style of thing. So it's important to play it right. So I don't interview loads and loads and loads of people, but in turn, that's because I put the trust in the relationships that I have with the recruiters that I work with, that they understand our culture and the sort of people that we're looking for, which Ellis does, to be fair. Credit where it's due.
And actually, honestly, I don't think the challenge is with the companies into over interviewing. I don't think that's the issue. I think the bigger issue is it's just very accessible if you're in the market for a new job to interview. So the talent pool are conducting like as many interviews as possible, and why not? I would do the same thing. So it's less about the companies interviewing lots of people, more about the candidates, really. And they've every right to, because they can. So that's why we're in this weird zone at the moment where, I mean, we're all noticing it. We've never had it. It's very unusual right now where you've got each candidate that's going for a job has so many interviews ongoing at the same time. And you're having these bizarre conversations with, okay, so how do you rank the company you've just met versus the other 8 this week? Like, they don't know themselves. Like, honestly, no one's being nasty. I don't think, how would you even rank that yourself? I think then it just probably comes down to like what we're talking about, value proposition, hiring process. I think 3S do a pretty good job at this as well. Like just a smooth, fast hiring process that really helps. Versus if you were interviewing with a bigger conglomerate and they took, I don't know, 3 months and 10 interviews. So you can always win on your streamlined hiring process.
Yeah, and I guess there's a couple of things I'm thinking through on that. Each one of you touched on the interview process and the speed of it. Well, from your perspective, in terms of investment, how quickly you get a team up and running, and also for yourself, that you could do all these interviews. How do you kind of keep that momentum, and then, still see enough candidates, but also keep that momentum, and maybe finishing this interview process quickly is in your interest if the other candidate has 8 other companies. How do you balance that ability again with the speed of hiring process, but make sure that you're also assessing the candidate correctly? What's the sweet spot of timing, I guess, on the interviews, or how many interviews would you hold or recommend?
There's all sorts of studies done on this, isn't there? I mean, you see best practices, maybe the best practice will say 4 rounds of interviews, including a panel interview and a presentation on round 4, followed by references. I think it depends on the company. I mean, and also what part of the process you are as well. Like the company might have already had the mandate open for 3 or 4 months, and the next person that walks in is clearly the one. And then maybe a smaller company, more nimble, they can offer the person on the spot. I mean, we've seen that as well. I mean, that can work. That's a real thing. And a smaller, nimble startup can do this versus if you were interviewing with a larger blue chip.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about your first employee, and Ellis, as you mentioned before, it's looking at the skill set of the founders and what's missing. So almost by definition, the first employee will have a skill set different to the founders, and therefore the founders will need to place a lot of trust in that employee to do what they've been brought in to do that the founders can't do themselves. So it's tried to say, but it's quite important to get that right. And whether that's time or something else, it's something I wouldn't necessarily rush unless there were competing pressures, as you say, in the market. But you can always fix things, but it's always best to get a superstar rather than the pretty good person for that first hire. It's
a controversial view, but I honestly believe hiring a head of people as early as you possibly can is essential. I think if you bring in someone with experience around people and talent and infrastructure, it's going to solve an awful lot of problems. it's something that happens in the States, quite common, because obviously they're just further ahead on building scale ups. So if you go around the Bay Area, they'll bring in a scale up people person very quickly within the first 5 to 10 employees. Where in the UK, typically, I think 3S, you did a pretty good job in bringing, well, you joined after 20, 25 employees. I think the typical number is about 50 headcount here until the first HR person's hired, which I would say is probably too late. It would be better if they hired this person, like I said, within 5 to 10 employees. Think of the money it would save the company as well on talent acquisition or just not making mistakes.
Yeah, I think that completely aligns with our worldview as a firm at Osney Capital. We're focused on operational resilience in early startups, and people and HR is such an important part of that. It can be, as you say, 20% of time, Anastasia, that's spent on hiring people. I don't know if that necessarily accounts for when it doesn't quite go right. It's a lot higher percentage than that, in my experience. And the complexity of getting it wrong or not having the systems in place and the people to do that sensibly can really slow you down.
An interesting observation is that we noticed founders that have built previous businesses, whether successfully or not quite, maybe they've not sold it onto become a unicorn, but maybe they've built businesses before, they will typically hire ahead of people as early as possible because they know the challenges that are coming, versus, say, first-time founders can sometimes be a bit dismissive of HR and also marketing as well, to be honest with you. But it definitely seems to be a line in the sand of build a business, that these are important hires, not build a business, and it's been a bit, I don't know, pushed away for something to deal with later on.
That's really interesting. Well, are you seeing these things in a proposal? Because obviously, like, very standard kind of approach that you would hear from a lot of places, the CTO, the CEO, etc. But have you been seeing people actually propose, head of HR, for example, as one of the first employees in their plan or in their 18-month plan?
Our experience probably aligns with Alistair's, actually. It's much later than we'd like to see, which is what we see as a gap in the market of how to help startups by thinking about operations and building for the success that you're promising rather than succeed and then pick it later.
Super interesting.
I think because the talent function, I think it's dismissed sometimes. Like, I think there's a long shopping list of what the scale up is trying to achieve, and the talent piece they just naturally assume will be almost organic, like, oh, the business is going to be amazing and we're going to take over the universe, so why wouldn't people want to join us immediately? It's only when reality kicks in they realize it might be a bigger problem than they initially anticipated.
And then maybe, can I turn to you, talk a bit about the onboarding piece and then retention as well? I know we are just conscious we have 10 minutes left, so I'm kind of want to move from the hiring piece to, so you've decided to bring somebody on. How do you deal with the onboarding piece? I mean, it took me like 3 months to join Barclays personally. So I know big companies take a very long time to get somebody on board, which could also be a problem. So if you could talk a bit more about your practice in that and your experience.
Yeah, so I think both onboarding and the incentive retention piece are both really organic for startups and scale-ups. So to have an onboarding process and it not change across a year or beyond that, I think would be one of the first mistakes to make when onboarding new talent. I've got 3 new starters on Tuesday, for example, already rechanging and rejigging the process and how we're looking at it and how to tweak it so that they're best onboarded with where we're at and where we are, again, back to that vision piece. So it's really all about chopping and changing and putting the time in to really onboard them as best you can. And it's not a 1 month or 2 months, it's a 6-month process with check-ins and refreshers and real time spent, especially with the remote management piece. When it comes to the retention side, I feel that bells and whistles are really great to attract the initial attention. So when you first say wellness budget or trip abroad or, all of that piece, it gets people excited. But when it comes to retention, I do think it loses its values because everyone offers free beer and lunch. So I think it's more what we try and look at is things like performance coaches or really good healthcare cover, the stuff that really will support you in your time of need and shows that the business really cares about you beyond filling your belly. And I think that's the focus that should be had when it comes to the retention side, though of course the free lunch is good too.
Maybe
Yeah.
Anastasia, we can open up for if there's any questions for
Yeah,
Paul,
of course.
Leah, or Ellis. If there's anyone on the call that would like to ask a question for either of our speakers, please just unmute and ask.
Tony, it's Mick here.
Hey, mate.
You knew I'd jump in first. Listen, this has been fascinating because as I come out of a big institution and fall into the full eco space, etc., it's fascinating, particularly listen to Alia talk about how she's moving from startup to scale up and think about those recruitment challenges, etc. I was just going to ask around go back to the values and culture again. Clearly, when you work in as I've written strategy decks in big organizations, you do try and write, these are our values, this is our culture. And how's that challenge for a startup, particularly when you're trying to bring employees in or helping who's actually going to associate with that value statement, etc.
Well, I think this actually feeds right into what Ellis mentioned about hiring a people person.
Yeah.
Because what I was able to do, or I mean, I can't take credit, we were able to do as a business was we did a little bit of hiring, did a little bit of scaling, and then we really looked at who we'd been hiring. What are the values that have been organically grown while we're at this 30 to 40 people stage? Then I had the help of marketing, the founders to really flesh out the values, you know, the classic own it, care personally, you know, really see what values align to where we are and how we want to replicate our business and scale, and then hire based on that, and then continuously loop back to them. And so I think that is testament to itself that the people team needs to exist early doors to really be able to flesh that out and grow on that side and have a focus on it.
Yeah, I think some sort of North Star needs to be there to start with, and then you can build the culture around that. I was chatting to a founder the other day, and a phrase that's just stuck with me since, he talked about when they hire people, it's not so much about culture fit, because of course they're small and their culture is still growing. It's about culture add towards that North Star. And I thought that was a really nice way to think about it.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Any more? Well, thank you.
Well, actually, sorry, just very, very quickly, Tony, if I can. So, right, Alan, I'm working on my third startup, and the first was 2008, a long time ago, and that was in Asia. Second was in London, 2013, 14, 15, and coming back now a few years, the environment is very different. And I'll just tell you, and for any comment or help at all, the challenges I have is, firstly, now people are much more specialist than they were, you know, those years ago. We kind of brought people in and nurtured them. We gave them a great opportunity. You know, there wasn't a Monzo. I mean, we started the same time as Revolut, Monzo, you know, Starling, and we were, you know, basically building things as we went along. And so we took people with raw talent. Now, if someone says they're a front-end Android developer, I can't really work with that easily. I need more generalists and product people rather than developers. And the second is just how to talk to potentially interested people. It's kind of, how do I access, you know, the pool of people that may be interested, you know, other than just a general on LinkedIn, which can get swamped with all sorts of stuff.
What do you think, Ellis?
Have you gone to any of the universities? I honestly think that it's still relatively untapped, because if you think about who's doing all the events at the university, it's all big blue chips. You know, you'll have Deloitte and Barclays, all, you know, big branded, very good companies, but there's not that many startup or scale ups that are actually spending time there. I think you can really pick up some amazing young talent who are desperate to work in a high growth young company.
No, you're absolutely on it.
Right.
We have a lot of the universities come through us here, Anastasia and I, where we looked after the MBA course from Oxford and the Aston Business School, and they come through us, well. And they're jumping in their seats to get involved with some of our fintechs.
Okay.
A number of those programs have entrepreneurial programs, internal or courses, And that's self-selecting people who are interested in the world that you're playing in. And they may have a small idea of their own that hasn't quite gotten anywhere, but have the skill set that you're looking for. I think that's a really good idea to go and meet people and network and recruit.
Yeah,
You can even
drop
go
me
and
an
give-
email and I can introduce you and give you an overview. So it's easy to remember, tony@thinkrise.com, and I'll share some information about them.
I've
Super,
got half a
thanks so
dozen or
much.
so. Sorry, I was just going to say, I've got half a dozen or so universities. I can put you in touch with their recruitment teams, and they would be, I'm quite sure, happy to introduce you. You could even probably go in and give a talk.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thanks so much. I'll do both.
Mm.
Awesome.
That specialization challenge is an interesting one, though. I'm not sure I have an answer to that. That's an interesting observation, though.
I definitely do agree, though, there has been a move away from generalists to specialization, and it's a little bit of it's a bit counterintuitive for a startup, because you get your classic, you wear many hats in a startup. And so when you have these specialized candidates that are amazing at what they do, it's harder to put on a different hat per se, and to really throw yourself into various different parts of the business.
But I do think the specialists are coming from more the blue chip background. Anyone working at a major conglomerate, they are given a role, and that's their role for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Versus if you go into a younger, high growth company, you've got to wear different hats. So it probably goes back to where have they spent their career to date.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Any final questions?
Sorry, and the level of people that you're hiring. I mean, I think I've worked for I'm on my fourth startup or scale up now, and they've all been different in terms of the people they work with. But the first one I worked with, we were all generalists. We all had to wear multiple hats when we were under 5 or 6 employees. That one's grown to, I think, 30 or 40 employees now. And people can specialize then. But I mean, I guess it also depends on your candidate profile. I mean, if somebody's a good front-end developer on whatever, there's a reasonable chance within 3 or 4 months they could learn something else if they're any good.
True.
That's if they want to. But I do think that generally the employment market rewards specialization. So I think if you think of maximum salaries that you can earn, it's being a specialist in a subsector. So if you're the master of any domain, whether it's, I don't know, you're a digital marketing expert within SaaS or fintech or payments, if that's what you've done for 5 to 10 years, you will get paid a premium for that versus a broader generalist digital marketing person. You just will earn more money.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd give that as a career advice though, because that's short term, isn't it? I mean, if you want to reach the C level in any decent sized company, you've got to be multi-capable.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, and technology changes. Android may be the fantastic thing now, but in 5 years' time, it could be something completely different. You've got to, I think it all depends where people are in their stage of their career. I mean, I think, some people, rise to be real stars with actually not being specialists in anything. And I think sometimes the best, founders are people who aren't specialists, but know how to hire them. Yeah.
I think that might go back to the point of, how much time can you spend with a person and how much you can get to know a person and just that you're selecting as well. So the whole process of actually trying to do that.
I guess as we round off, as always, it's always nice to go to each of you and say, if you could give one piece of advice, if you're considering, sort of your first employees as you're growing as a company, what would that be? And I'm going to go straight to the lawyer, Paul, start us off.
You know my answer. It's on my business card. But I think I'd say hire someone different to you.
Yeah. It's wicked.
Very good.
Never be scared of hiring talent that might seem more experienced than you, better than you, at a more developed stage than you, because it lights a fire under you, firecracker, but also they can bring so much expertise that can add to the business and its value.
Hallelujah to that.
Ellis?
Yeah, I can't really argue with what Paul said, really. I think the only thing I'd add is maybe just some testing as well. So maybe if you've found the right person, if you can and it's possible, bring them in on temporary project to start, just to see if you get on with each other, right? Because it should hopefully be a 5 to 10 year relationship. So a small 4-week period where you work together on a project seems sensible.
The last word to you, Anastasia. Thank you very much for looking after these guys and girls.
Oh, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for all of our brilliant panelists. I kind of wish we had more time, to be honest.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been really good fun.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Take care.